for some people, they said it was like a once-in-a-lifetime event, and it probably was. The coronation of King Charles III, or KC3, as some people have taken to calling it. I feel a little bit uncomfortable with that. Is it reverent enough? But for some people, this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. Elizabeth had reigned for so long, and so this really was once in a lifetime. For many people, they were kind of blissfully unbothered by the fact that there was a coronation taking place, and yet for others, it was the opportunity to prove their quintessential Britishness. What shall we do? How shall we prove that we are British? We will stand in long, damp queues, and we will hope mainly to get just a tiny little glimpse, and I'll get my camera phone out, and I'll see if I can get like a little glimpse, and if you zoom right in, you can see those 2 pixels over there. That's Charles's head, that's Camilla's head right there. And we can tell the grandkids we were there. It was just a chance to get a glimpse of the king at his coronation. And whether you were a royalist or not, the whole thing was spectacular. Like, first of all, it was spectacularly expensive. And they still haven't worked out the final cost yet, like 50 to 100 million. Fair play, that's spectacular. And then there was the spectacular kind of viewing audience. 300 to 400 million people around the world tuned in to watch this event. And then I think one of the things that was most spectacular for me was Penny Mordaunt's upper body strength. Like how on earth did she hold that sword for so long? And it wasn't a toy plastic sword. Even if it had been a toy plastic sword and she'd been holding it like that, when you stood in that position for 3/4 of an hour, you get cramps. That woman, fair play. If I had a hat, I would take it off, She's strong. And so it was spectacular. But then, the whole thing was kind of heaving with symbols, wasn't it? You had the robe that was placed on him. You had the crown that was put on his head, the throne that he sat on, the oil with which he was anointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the scepter, the sign of power and authority that was placed in his hand. At the end of it all, nobody was in any doubt at all who was king. And yet, what about a way more significant coronation? What Bernie has just read to us, that is the most significant coronation in the whole history of the universe. That is the coronation of the King of Kings. But who can actually see this king at his coronation? Because it's the polar opposite of what you would expect for a coronation. It's everything that is the complete opposite of KC3's coronation, isn't it? And it's unexpected. And it's a paradox, because what looks like utter humiliation for Jesus is actually his glory. And not everyone can see the glory of the king in the glory of the cross. And yet he will take his throne through suffering and death. By a seeming defeat, he will defeat his enemies, and he will be enthroned as the everlasting king. That's what we've just heard. But not everyone can see it. And the narrative there, you've got this kind of mix of people that are kind of woven in together. And as we walk through this journey towards the cross, as we walk through it step by step, you see these people, and we'll pick them out as we go. But the people that can't see, or that won't see Jesus, you've got these soldiers that are beating him and mocking him. You've got the crowd that are mercilessly mocking him. The chief priests who have orchestrated all of this, that are mocking him. And then you've got those that can see. You've got this random passerby stranger who ends up carrying the cross of Jesus, Simon. You've got the influence of the prophets who hundreds of years before saw what would happen, and Mark's woven all of that into the story. You've got the women and Joseph of Arimathea, and we don't have time to go into the details of them. And yet I want to give them an honorable mention, because here are people who in a time of great risk to be associated with Jesus, they stood with him. They stood with the condemned criminal. They were willing to put their necks on the line because they had seen enough to know that this was a king that was worth living for and worth dying for. And then you've got the centurion. We'll come back to the centurion. But it's occurred to me that this is the dividing line of humanity. We put in so many other kind of arbitrary dividing lines in humanity along kind of race and sex and wealth and all of these kind of things. But actually, all of those things matter nothing. This is the dividing line of humanity. Either we see Jesus or we don't. And if we see him, then how do we respond to him rightly? And this has been the question that Mark's been asking us all the way through. What about you? Can you see him? Can you see him? And even at this moment now, in this coronation, what Mark wants us to see, Mark is trying to help us to see who Jesus really is so that we respond to him rightly. And it is not overstating the case to say that whether we see him or not, there is nothing that is more important. There is nothing of greater import. There is nothing that matters more in this life and in eternity than whether we see him and whether we respond rightly to him. So first of all then, how's Mark helping us? Well, he gives us these kind of symbols of coronation. There's a coronation that's taking place. And Jesus is now in the hands of the soldiers. And these soldiers are brutal. These are people who were renowned for finding ways, finding ways to be cruel. Jesus had already been scourged. He'd already been weakened by what he'd experienced. And now these soldiers are about to give him a kind of mocking coronation. And so the symbols are all there. They put this purple robe on him. Purple is the color of royalty. And it's not even his own robe, it's one that they've borrowed, and yet he's the only one who is worthy of wearing this color of royalty. But these soldiers can't see it. They just mock him. And then they put this crown of thorns on his head, and they think that they're mocking, and yet actually what they're doing, there is something, bless you. My goodness, there's like so many sneezes in this place this morning. It's just as well we're not mid-COVID anymore. Yeah, anyway, sorry, that was unhelpful. This crown of thorns, there is something that is so incredibly beautiful in this crown of thorns. What they're doing as an act of horror is actually a sign of beauty. Think back to Genesis 3. Adam and Eve turned their backs on God. They said, we don't want your kingship. We don't want your rulership over us. And God said, because of this, the ground will be cursed. And every time you try and work it, it's going to produce thorns. Jesus, at his coronation, is bearing the symbol of the cursed ground to show that what he is going to do is to uncurse the ground so that all things will be made new. I think the symbol in this coronation that has upset me the most is that a king was anointed with oil that would be the symbol of the presence of God with them. And yet at this coronation, all Jesus is anointed with is the spit of these soldiers. He is anointed with the spite and the malice of humanity. And then they beat him with this reed. And the reed is a kind of mocking scepter, the symbol of rule and authority. And yet the irony is that they're only able to beat him with this sign of authority because in his authority, in his unlimited power, he is allowing this to take place. But they can't see it. And even in this moment, they don't let him keep the kind of borrowed symbols, these mocking symbols of royalty. They take it all off him. They put his own clothes on him. And they didn't see what was right in front of their faces. They just couldn't see him. And then the soldiers lead Jesus out on this kind of ultimate walk of shame. But now we come to one who did see Jesus. This randomer. And I love the detail here. They compelled. So right, imagine you are Simon of Cyrene. All right, he's just out for a walk. He's on his way in from the country. This procession of shame is heading towards Calvary, towards Golgotha, and they grab this random passerby who's just out for a walk, and they say he's in a weakened state. He can't carry his own cross. You need to carry the cross for him. And so his life now intersects. It hits a crossroads with Jesus at this crucial point. And you think, well, why the details? Why do we know that he's from Cyrene, and why do we need to know that he's got these two kids, Rufus and Alexander? So if you ever have any more children, you fancy naming them Rufus is a biblical name. Who knew? I had a neighbor called Rufus. I didn't know it was a biblical name. But anyway, it is. And so Rufus and Alexander, why do we need to know about Rufus and Alexander? Well, this is written within a generation. Fact check. We love a good fact check these days, don't we? And we need a good fact check. But here's an opportunity for people in this day to fact check. These people are real. They existed. Simon and his children. You want to check that out? If that's true, the rest of it's true as well. And here's a cheeky little detail here, right? Lots of scholars think that this Rufus here is actually the same Rufus that Paul writes about in Romans 16. Say hi to Rufus for me. Rufus is my pal. And Rufus was a friend of Paul and a follower of Jesus. Now, think about what this means. Simon, random passerby, coming in from the country, compelled to walk with Jesus, this walk of shame. In that time that Simon's walking with Jesus, he sees enough of this bloodied, beaten, broken man to know that this is a king who is worthy of laying down my life for. And it changes the trajectory of his family's life from there on in. Simon saw. He saw Jesus. He saw the glory of the king in the glory of the cross. And you know, now there's a detail for us in this too. In verse 22, it says, they brought him to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. Now, you know when you think about skulls, what do we associate with skulls? What is a skull the symbol of? Death. Now, aside from Jesus and the two criminals that are with him, what is going to die at this place of death? Death. People, this is such good news. At the place of death, death will die in the death of Christ. Death is doomed. This is such good news. Let's keep walking. Verse 24, and they crucified him. You kind of feel like this is a little bit dry on Mark's part, isn't it? You know, he doesn't give any details about how the crucifixion actually takes place and what is done to Jesus. But he doesn't need to. Because you know, if he's writing to people who are first century Roman occupied, they're going to know all of the gory details. They're not going to need any kind of telling about how crucifixion happens. You know, it's horrendous, it's brutal. Those of you that have seen Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ, will know what I mean. When he set out to make that film, he said that he was going to make it as historically accurate as he possibly could. And because of that, there was no way that film was coming in a PG. It is horrific. It is absolutely horrific. Now, what I don't want to do this morning, I don't want to go into those details because I don't think we need them. But there are some details that are actually really important for us to know so that we understand some of the things that Mark tells us later. So a crucifixion would happen where nails were put not through the hands, because if body weight is hanging and you put a nail there, then it will tear straight through. And the Romans knew how to torture people. So they would put the nail there in between the forearm bones, which was much better to kind of hold it in place. And then, crossing their feet, they would either kind of tie them to the cross or nail them through their ankle bones. Now, the issue with this is when you're stuck in this position, your rib cage is doing unnatural things, and you can't breathe. And so the vast majority of crucifixion victims would suffocate. Now, if they wanted to breathe, to get their rib cage to work properly, they'd have to push themselves up like that. Now, the thing is, imagine if your feet are nailed. How do you do that? And so the amount of effort that would be expended in this process, and so it was suffocation and exhaustion. They couldn't breathe. And that really matters. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now, here's the thing. The prophets foresaw this, right? Mark wants us to see that for all of the evil that is on display here, God was still in control and had purposed for Jesus to save humanity this way. I was going to say at this point, you know, if you've never read Psalm 69 and Psalm 22, like, if you have time, go read them. No, make time. Make time to read Psalm 69 and Psalm 22 because they feel like David has been transported in time several hundred years and has actually witnessed the cross. It feels like he was there. And there are just a couple of details here that in Psalm 69 and Psalm 22, Mark kind of weaves in just so that we see that God was in control of all of this. Now, the first detail is in Psalm 69. They offered him myrrh mixed with wine. Now, why would they offer him myrrh mixed with wine? Myrrh was apparently a sedative, and they would give crucifixion victims a sedative to take the edge off the pain. And yet Jesus refused. And Jesus refused because he was going to drink this cup of judgment down to its dregs and be fully aware of it all the way. Not only that, but the next detail. Psalm 22 says, they cast lots for my clothing. Well, what did the soldiers do? They took his clothing and they basically played dice for who was going to get what. David had seen this. He'd seen this many hundreds of years before it happened. And this raises a question for us. And the question that it raises for us is this. If they took his clothing, was Jesus naked? And we don't know because we're not told. But even if all he had was a loincloth, in that culture, that would be enough to be regarded as being naked and ashamed. And so there he is, nailed to a cross. Haters, mockers, naked and ashamed, or near naked and ashamed. There is shame upon shame upon shame being heaped upon him at this point. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. That would be about 9 a.m. in our time. And above his head is the rap sheet. Basically, what's the charge against him? And the charge that's against him is the King of the Jews. Now, this would have been a title that the Romans would have used for him. It wouldn't have been a title that the Jewish people would have used. They would have called him the King of Israel. And yet, Pilate chose to put the Roman charge above his head. Now, is this because Pilate had seen who Jesus was at this point? Or do you think that Pilate is just winding the religious leaders up? Yeah, I'm sure if we take a quick vote, we know where we're going with that. And yet, here's the thing. Even in winding up the religious leaders, the truth is there above his head for all to see. Anyone who has eyes to see can see that this is the king, and this is his coronation. But then we have more that just won't see. The crowds who mock him, they misinterpret his words against him. Verse 27, with him they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." Now this whole detail about wagging their heads, David saw this. Psalm 22, "But I am a worm, not a man, scorned by mankind, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me, they wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord, let him deliver him, let him rescue him, for he delights in him." David saw this before it happened, and here they are. They're fulfilling all of this. And they mock him. They say, "Save yourself, come down from the cross." Now the question is, could Jesus have come down from the cross if he had wanted to? Could he have unleashed all of the armies of heaven against these people? Absolutely. Do you know why he didn't? Because he's love. And this crowd mock him. Things that they say, "Save yourself, come down from the cross." And then you've got these chief priests and the scribes. They mock him to one another. He saved others. He can't save himself. Now, any of you enjoy being mocked? Think about the worst mocking that you've ever had. How did it make you feel? Amplify that up by being near naked, nailed to a cross before a crowd, haters hating. This is horrendous. And the things that they're saying to him, he saved others. This is the chief priests, right? So this is the chief priests, the people who have orchestrated his execution. Couldn't carry it out. Got somebody else to do their dirty work, but they orchestrated this. He saved others. They knew that he was a good guy. They knew that he was innocent. And so when they say this last kind of taunt, "Let the Christ, the King of Israel," see, that's their title for him, "Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe." Do you reckon they would? Do you reckon they would really believe? Have they not seen him heal the sick, raise the dead, cast out demons, cleanse lepers, preach peace, forgive sins, calm storms? They've seen it all. They know it all. They've seen enough. They will not see who he is. It doesn't matter. And those who were crucified with him also reviled him. Now remember that Mark is on a mission in writing his story quickly, and so he moves on from these 2 criminals either side, and yet Luke gives us a little bit of extra detail. He says, "One of the criminals who were hanged railed at Jesus, saying, 'Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us.' But the other rebuked him, saying, 'Do not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation. And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong.' And he said to Jesus, 'Remember me when you come into your kingdom.'" And what does Jesus say to him at this point? "You didn't go to synagogue enough. You weren't kind to the lady next door. You shouldn't have gone on the rob. No, actually put some of those things right, and then we'll think about it." Is that what Jesus said to him? Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. The grace, the mercy, and the kindness of Jesus. He requires nothing but that we see that he is the king, and in this king is our only hope. You think about what this criminal is looking at. The criminal is looking at a man who is bleeding from the wounds of the thorns in his head. He is bleeding from the wounds of his scourging. He is bleeding from the wounds in his hands and his feet. And he is nailed to this cross, near naked. Everybody else sees a defeated, condemned man. What does the criminal see? He sees a king. Because that's what he says. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. Who has a kingdom? A king. The guy sees it. And the king that he sees is a gracious and a merciful and a kind king who requires nothing but that we see who he is and that we recognize that this king is our only hope. And that we receive the gift of grace that is Jesus himself. And you know, even at the moment of death, he still holds out life for those who will place their faith in him. But you know, why wait? Why wait? He doesn't just offer us hope for the age to come. He offers us life to the full in the now. See him as king and come to him. Receive him. Here's the thing. He took the darkness of judgment upon himself. Verse 33, when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. Now this is midday. Midday, and darkness comes across the land for 3 hours. Now, there are some people who would say that this is an eclipse. Eclipses last max 7 minutes. This is not an eclipse. If you think it's an eclipse, I'll fight you for it, okay? And we'll have a chat about it later. I won't really fight you. I'm a man of peace, you know? But yeah, this is not an eclipse. This is supernatural darkness. The light of the world is here becoming sin for humanity. He's becoming sin for us, and nature responds as the light of the world is experiencing the darkness of judgment. And darkness signifies judgment. You think about what happened in Egypt when the judgment came against the firstborn. Darkness fell over the whole land, and now here as the only begotten Son, the firstborn of all creation, is bearing in himself the judgment against our sin, so darkness falls. And that darkness falls for 3 hours, and for 3 hours Jesus is stretched out between heaven and earth, bearing the darkness of the judgment against our sin. And then at 3 p.m. he cries out with a loud voice. Now, should Jesus have been able to cry out with a loud voice? No, he shouldn't have. Excuse me. He shouldn't have been able to cry out with a loud voice. This is supernatural. But what does he cry out? He cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now what's happening here? Do you know there are a number of different views about what's going on when Jesus cries this out? And there are those that think that what is taking place is that there is actually an actual separation between the Father and the Son, that the Father can no longer bear to look at the Son, and that there is actual separation between Father and Son. Again, it can't be true. It can't be true because there can be no division in God. If he is divided, then he is no longer God. God is Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And so what is actually taking place here? Well, we need to see what Jesus is doing. Remember Psalm 22. You need to go away and read Psalm 22. I'm telling you. Psalm 22 is the first line. Psalm 22 verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's the first line. And it's a psalm that begins in lament. It's a psalm that begins where David feels like he's surrounded by the enemies of God. It's almost like he's having a first-person flash forward to the cross. And Jesus in that moment, having inspired and now having memorized the kind of this songbook, this prayer book, in this moment of deep kind of brokenness, pain, this is what it feels like. Why have you handed me over to death? This was the cry of the psalmist. But the thing is, we also need to remember that in this culture, they had a tradition of memorization. And so because they memorized the whole Psalms, you say the first line, and the rest of it kind of falls into place. Now, if I say, first I was afraid, I was petrified, how many of you have a chorus in your mind at this point? Because it's just there, isn't it? Or, we're no strangers to love. You know the rules, and so do I. You're all there. Many of you are. Some? You've never been rickrolled. Oh, thanks, Paul. But here's the thing. Jesus says this first line, and immediately everyone who has memorized this Hebrew prayer book, they're there in their heads, and they don't just stay at my God, why have you forsaken me? They end up at the end of the psalm, which is a victory. It says, all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you, for kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. This is where all this is headed, even in this moment of feeling forsaken. That's where it's headed. This is heading for victory. Absolute victory, and the kingship of Jesus over the nations. And even at this point, the crowd can't stop mocking, Oh, he's calling for Elijah, because Elijah was regarded by some as being the patron saint of lost causes. And so they're mocking Jesus still here, and we'll give him some wine to keep him going until Elijah gets here. Those who won't see Jesus as king, they mock him. And it still happens now. But this is the pinnacle, all right? If you've wandered off at this point, this is the most important bit, okay? There is no more important bit than this bit, okay? I could have told you at the start, fall asleep for the first 20 minutes, okay? Because this is the most important bit. These two statements are just huge. They are so important, and this is the point that Mark wants us to see, okay? Verse 37, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. It is not normal for crucified people to cry out with a loud voice. They just kind of fade into suffocation. And Jesus cries out with a loud voice. This is supernatural power. This is no ordinary death. One of the other Gospels tells us that at this point, he gave up his spirit. Jesus chose when to give up his spirit. And do you know what that tells us? At any point, he could have called time on it, but he didn't call time on it until it was done. And in John's Gospel, at this point, he cries out, it is finished. It's done. And how do we know that it's finished? How do we know that it's mission accomplished for Jesus? We know because at the point where the Son of God, who is stretched out between heaven and earth, cries his last, so the temple curtain is torn in two from top to bottom. And this curtain is a massive visual theological statement. The whole Bible story, remember how sin separates humans from God. And because humans rebel against God, so heaven and earth are separated. And the temple is kind of the overlap of heaven and earth, is the dwelling place of God with man. But you can't just waltz into the most holy place. God's holiness is dangerous to people who are carrying their sin. And the Holy of Holies, this central space, this God space, this is the place where one priest can come once a year to offer sacrifice for the sins of the people. You go in impure, you die. And there's this huge curtain there as a warning, as a sign. This curtain reminds us that because of our sin, we can't come in. It's got cherubim painted on it with flaming swords that are a reminder, or embroidered onto it as a reminder that actually this is not safe to go into, just to waltz in, that something needs to happen to allow us back into the presence of God. But I forgot to mention this. This is no small curtain. This curtain is ginormous. 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, at least 4 inches wide. That's a big old curtain. That doesn't tear by accident. But at the moment when the Son of God is stretched out between heaven and earth, cries his last, that curtain is torn in two from top to bottom. Now, here's an interesting little thing. I tried to get an AI to paint this picture. I tried to get an AI to paint this picture 5 times, and the AI could not get the curtain to be torn from top to bottom. Just couldn't fathom it. Why do you think it couldn't fathom it? Because it's the wrong way. Who is tearing the curtain? God. And you know the word for torn is only used twice in Mark's gospel. It's used once at the baptism of Jesus, when the heavens are torn open and the presence of God in the Holy Spirit comes down and rests on the Son and says, "This is my beloved Son, in him I'm well pleased. You are my beloved Son, in you I'm well pleased." And then the second time, as the Son is nailed to the cross, as he cries out his last, so the heavens are torn once more. Heaven invades earth once again. The reunion of heaven and earth has begun. The Father is pleased with the Son. The Father is delighted with the Son. And the Father says, because of the firstborn, he says to the rebels, "Come, my children, come on home. You are welcome. You are welcome." And you know, there's one person here who really sees this. Remember, right at the beginning of Mark's gospel, Mark said to us, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. We are meant to see that this is Jesus. This is who he is. He is the Christ, the Son of God. He is the Messiah. He is the Redeemer King. And we are meant to see his full identity revealed in this moment. And there were three kind of big testimony moments to Jesus' identity throughout Mark's gospel. The first one, at his baptism, the heavens are torn. Spirit of God comes down, rests on Jesus, and we hear the voice of God for the benefit of Jesus saying to Jesus, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." The second testimony to his identity on the Mount of Transfiguration, where this time heaven is not torn open, but heaven kind of envelops this mountain. And this time, the voice of the Father speaks for the benefit of the disciples and says, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. But now, this third time, who is it that testifies at this moment that heaven is once again torn open? It's a surprise. At his death, at his coronation, at his glory, as he breathes his last, as heaven is torn open, there is this unlikely witness, the Roman centurion, the outsider, the Gentile. And he is the one who truly sees and declares that this is the identity of Jesus. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Now, this man had seen so many deaths in his life. Doubtless will have come close to death so many times. And yet this death was unlike any other. He'd never seen a death like this before. And in this death, the full identity of Jesus is seen. He sees it. And you know, in a king who sacrifices himself, in a king who takes his throne through suffering and death, this is the identity of our God. Jesus didn't do this to become God. He did this precisely because he is God. This is what our God is like. And so Jesus was then taken down from the cross. He was buried in a borrowed grave. There were women who watched where he was buried. They knew where he was buried, in this borrowed tomb. And it seems like a heartbreaking, tragic end to this story. But we know it's not. At the place of death, death will die in the death of Christ. Death is doomed. And so his question is, can you see him? Can you see the glory of the King in the glory of the cross? Can you see the one who dies a criminal's death, the King of all glory, who establishes the kingdom through sacrifice, who turns worldly power on its head, who suffers and serves to take his throne, who defeats sin and death by becoming sin and dying, who through his suffering and obedience is enthroned forever as the King above all kings. The one who gave his life for you and for me. Can you see him? Can you see his love and his grace and his mercy and his kindness that transforms all who follow him into a community of self-giving love? Can you see that he's worth laying down your life for, laying down everything for, trusting in him, following him, having life in him? Can you see him? You said it wasn't a good idea. I'm trying really hard. So this week, just as many of you have done, And as we all will do at some point, we stood in a room in the presence of death. And death is an ugly, dirty fighter. Death is a pollutant in this creation. Death is not natural. Do you wonder why we respond to death in the way that we do? It's because it was never meant to be part of this creation. But you know, as we stood there, the Lord reminded me of some words, and I didn't know where the words were from, and so I looked them up. It was a question. What is your only comfort in life and death? So I had to look it up. Where's it from? And it's from this thing called the Heidelberg Catechism, which we don't really do catechisms much, but maybe we should. What is your only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own, but belong, body and soul, in life and death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. He has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood, and he has set me free from the tyranny of the devil. He also watches over me in such a way that not a hair can fall from my head without the will of my Father in heaven. In fact, all things must work together for my salvation, because I belong to him. Christ, by his Holy Spirit, assures me of eternal life and makes me wholeheartedly willing and ready from now on to live for him. What must you know to live and die in the joy of this comfort? 3 things. First, how great my sin and misery are. Cheery. Second, how I am set free from all my sins and misery. And third, how I am to thank God for such deliverance. Dang, he's good, isn't he? He is so good. And you know, as we stood there in the presence of that last enemy, I was reminded that this is what Jesus came to kill. The King forever has dealt the decisive blow to death at the cross. And there is coming a day when all who die in him will be raised indestructible, and death will be no more. When we see him, we see that it's not just life eternal, but it's life that begins now. It's a fullness of life in him. There is a quality of life in Jesus that we can't even get close to. And do you know what? He offers that moment to the thief on the cross. But why wait? Why wait for that moment? You know, if you've given your life to Jesus, ask him for a greater glimpse of who he is by the power of the Spirit. Ask the Spirit to reveal to him, to reveal to you the beauty of who he is, so that by the power of the Spirit then we're able to live more fully for him and to display what he's like in this world. That bit there. And makes me, by his Spirit, wholeheartedly willing and ready from now on to live for him. Imagine how many people outside of this room need to know that death is the final enemy, and yet death has been beaten. Death has been beaten by Jesus. And so to come to him and to give your life to him, to give yourself lock, stock, and barrel to the one who unites himself to you by faith, who reveals the fullness of his love to you, transforms you into the image that you were already created to bear. There are so many people in this world that need to hear that good news. And you know, if you haven't given your life to Jesus, there is no day like today. There is no time like the present. Be like the centurion, the one who sees this king in all of the gory glory of the cross, who sees the wonder of who he is and says, truly this man was the Son of God. And if he's the Son of God, if he's the king, he's got a kingdom. And if he's the king, then I need to bow before him. And he deserves my everything. Shall we pray?